Welcome back to The Remote Islander, your go-to podcast for all things remote work in the Caribbean. And if you followed me for a while, you'll notice that my background looks a little different. We are not in the country, not in Trinidad. We are doing some traveling and living our best remote work life. But of course, had to record an episode for you guys, all right? Today is a really serious episode though, because I want to start with a number that stopped me cold when I came across it. According to IMF research, the Caribbean has lost between 10 and 40% of its total labor force to emigration to Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries. That stat alone is striking, but here is where it becomes genuinely alarming. For the highly skilled professionals with university-level education, some Caribbean nations have lost more than 70% of that workforce. 70%. Doctors, engineers, marketers, developers, accountants, gone. Not to the economy next door, but to the UK, Canada, the United States, and increasingly further afield. The World Bank, in a background paper on Caribbean migration, found that 6 out of 15 Caribbean countries studied, the number of people who have emigrated exceeded 50% of the resident population. And for Jamaica specifically, a 2024 World Bank analysis showed that there are nearly as many Jamaican-born nurses working in the United States as there are working in Jamaica itself. Here's what that actually costs us. The IMF estimates that for some Caribbean economies, this loss of human capital is equivalent to 10 to 30% of potential GDP once you account for the loss of productivity, entrepreneurship, and tax contributions that have walked out the door with every person who left. And UN data on small island states puts our collective loss of skilled workers as high as 60% regionally, one of the highest brain drain rates anywhere in the world. We talk a lot about the opportunity of remote work. Today, I want to dig into a more uncomfortable question. Why isn't that opportunity converting for the people who are positioned to benefit from it, specifically in the Caribbean? Because here's the thing, the global remote work market hasn't disappeared, but the real story is sharper than things leveled off. LinkedIn's own economic graph team tracked this directly in the US. The share of jobs offering remote flexibility peaked at 27% in 2022 and had fallen to 16% by late 2024. Across the 15 countries LinkedIn studied, the average share of remote roles had dropped to about 1 in 10 by the end of that year. And the slide hasn't stopped. Robert Half's own first quarter 2026 hiring data puts fully remote roles at just 4% of new US postings, with another 19% hybrid and the rest fully on-site. Here's what makes that genuinely unfair though. Demand never came down to match it. In the US, more than 1 in 5 job seekers still apply exclusively to remote roles, even though only 16% of jobs actually offer it. That gap, more people wanting remote work than companies are willing to offer, is exactly the mismatch we're dealing with today. And it has gotten wider, not narrower, since this whole conversation started. The demand is there though. The talent in the Caribbean is there, highly educated, English proficient, aligned culturally with major North American and European markets. And yet, the connection just isn't happening at the scale that it should. So today, I want to get into why, and more importantly, what to actually do about it. Let's start with a structural reality check, because any honest conversation about the Caribbean remote work gap has to begin there. The countries in our region are small. That smallness has always made them structurally vulnerable to talent outflow. Small economies are less diversified. they generate less demand for specialized skills, and they sit geographically close to some of the world's largest and most prosperous labor markets. The World Bank has written about this directly. Proximity to the US makes emigration a default option in a way that simply does not apply to, say, a professional in Southeast Asia. For Caribbean talent, the path out has been doable. For decades, a dominant policy response to brain drain has been hand-wringing and bonding schemes. Caribbean governments have tried requiring graduates who receive subsidized education to stay and work locally for a number of years before leaving. The World Bank's own analysis of these programs found them to be largely ineffective. Overseas recruiters routinely pay to buy out financial obligations, and enforcement mechanisms are weak. The question remote work forces us to ask is a different one entirely. What if leaving didn't have to mean losing? If a Trinidadian software developer can be employed by a Toronto company while living in Port of Spain, the country retains their tax contribution, their local spending, their mentorship capacity, their presence. The economy benefits. The professional gets the global salary. This is the deal remote work theoretically offers, and it is being taken up, just not at the scale the region deserves. And if you guys listen to Oshido Christie, he talks about this all the time. This is why he started Carivo, to allow Jamaican workers to stay at home, earn foreign currency, but not having to leave, not having to give up your home country. So what's getting in the way? I've looked at this from several different angles, and I want to walk through what the data actually shows, because there are both individual barriers and structural ones, and they interact in ways that aren't always obvious. Let's start with the individual side of the equation, because it's where change is most immediately possible. The first thing the data makes clear is that how we think about credentials is out of step with how the global hiring market actually works. LinkedIn's skill-based hiring research shows that the vast majority of recruiters say they want to prioritize skills over degrees. McKinsey's workforce research indicates that hiring for skills is 5 times more predictive of job performance than hiring based on education. And the 2024 Burning Glass Institute analysis found that 43% of roles that historically required a bachelor's degree could effectively be performed by workers without one. But here's the critical nuance, and this is where a lot of the headlines on this topic mislead people. Harvard Business School and the Burning Glass Institute published research showing a significant gap between what companies say and what they do. While many major employers publicly announced they were dropping degree requirements, only 37% of those firms actually changed their hiring behavior in practice. The stated policy shifted. The actual hiring criteria often didn't. So what does that mean for Caribbean professionals? It means 2 things are true simultaneously. 1, you cannot rely on your degree as your primary differentiator in a global field. And 2, you must demonstrate skills so clearly that the gap between stated policy and actual practice works in your favor, not against you. The professionals getting through aren't waiting for companies to formally drop degree requirements. They are showing up with portfolios, case studies, specific tools listed by name: HubSpot, Python, Figma, Salesforce. They are quantifying their impact: revenue grown, cost reduced, efficiency improved. They are making it easy for a recruiter to see capability without having to infer it from institutional credentials alone. Now, this is not a Caribbean-specific challenge. This is the new reality of global hiring, but it requires a mindset shift that, frankly, many Caribbean educational systems have not yet built into how they prepare graduates for the market. I mean, growing up, how many of us were taught that the path to success was to go to high school, write CXC, get all your passes, go to UE, get a degree, and that was all you needed. And that worked then, but not now. The second barrier is technical, and it's one that catches a lot of people off guard. Nearly every major international company uses what's called an Applicant Tracking System, or ATS. These are software platforms that process job applications before a human recruiter sees them. As of 2025, more than 98% of Fortune 500 companies use a detectable ATS, with Workday alone handling over 39% of that market. Now, there's been a lot of noise online about ATS automatically rejecting resumes. You've probably seen figures like 75% of resumes never reach a human, shared widely on LinkedIn and career advice blogs. A November 2025 study by Enhanced CV put that claim to the test across real companies and found it to be largely a myth. 92% of recruiters do not use auto-rejection based on content or formatting. So your resume almost certainly is reaching someone. The real story is both more mundane and more sobering. The black hole effect, where you apply and never hear back, is primarily caused by volume. Popular remote roles on major platforms can receive 400 or more applications within the first 72 hours of posting. Recruiters simply stop reading after the first few dozen. By the time your application arrives, the pile is already closed in practice, even if the listing is still technically open. But here's the practical reality that doesn't change regardless of how the filtering technically works. If your resume doesn't mirror the language in the job description, if it uses graphically complex layouts that cannot be parsed cleanly, if it's one generic document sent to dozens of different roles, you are going to the bottom of every pile. Research from JobScan found that 76% of recruiters search for candidates using specific skills directly from the job description. If those words aren't in your application, you don't show up in the search. That's not an algorithm rejecting you. That's a recruiter never finding you. The fix is genuinely straightforward. Use clean formatting, mirror the language of each posting, customize every application, and treat keyword alignment as a technical requirement of modern job searching. This is especially true when applying to international companies from the Caribbean, where you may not have an ambient professional network to help get you noticed. The third barrier, geographic filtering, and this one is entirely avoidable. When Caribbean professionals search for remote jobs on most major platforms, the default location filter is set to a specific country, often the United States. Many people never change it, so they spend months applying to roles that specifically require U.S. work authorization, getting auto-screened out at the very first stage and concluding that the market isn't open to them. Meanwhile, a growing ecosystem of genuinely global remote roles exists, listings labeled worldwide, work from anywhere, global remote, or associated with companies that operate as fully distributed teams or remote-first companies. These are the roles where Caribbean candidates are actually competitive, but they do require intentional searching. And guys, I did a couple episodes about remote-first companies, about how to search using these terms, so definitely check that out, and they will be in the links below. Platforms like We Work Remotely, remote.co, and specific LinkedIn filters for location-agnostic roles represent a fundamentally different opportunity pool than the general job boards most people start with. Changing your search strategy isn't a small thing. It's the difference between applying to jobs you're eligible for and jobs you're not. Fourth barrier, LinkedIn visibility or the lack of. And this is something we've touched on in previous episodes, which I'll link below as well. As of 2025, 89% of recruiters globally are active on LinkedIn. It is the world's dominant professional talent marketplace. I mean, I like to joke and call it corporate Facebook, but this is the reality. 49 to 50 million people use it to search for jobs every single week. And here's the statistic that should really land. LinkedIn profiles with multiple skill endorsements receive 17 times more views from recruiters than those without. Not 17% more, 17 times more. A complete profile with a picture, a specific headline, listed tools and platforms, measurable achievements in the experience section, and regular engagement with professional content is not a nice to have. It is the basic infrastructure of being findable in the global hiring ecosystem. The problem is that most Caribbean professionals treat LinkedIn as a digital CV archive rather than an active professional presence. A generic headline that says open to work, no tools listed, no metrics, no posts or engagement in months. In a market where recruiters are actively sourcing candidates rather than just reviewing applications, that profile might as well not exist. Let's put some numbers to this, right? Because the scale of the disparity is genuinely staggering. And it starts with a problem that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. A significant portion of Caribbean professionals just aren't on LinkedIn. Not at all. Not with a weak profile, not with an incomplete one, just entirely absent from the platform where the majority of global hiring now begins. That alone is a crisis. But even among those who are registered, LinkedIn crossed 1.3 billion members globally in early 2026, and the entire Caribbean, all of its islands, all of its professionals, all of its talent accounts for approximately 6.5 million of those. That is half of 1%. Not 5%, not even 1%. Half of 1%. For context, the United States alone has over 230 million LinkedIn users. Brazil has 83 million. India has 148 million. Now, granted, these places are a lot bigger. So yes, it makes sense that they're going to have so many people, right? But even within that already tiny 6.5 million, the numbers are bunched into a handful of markets. The DR at around 2.2 million, Puerto Rico at 1.2 million, Trinidad and Tobago just clearing 600,000, Jamaica around 450,000. Strip those out and the rest of the region is almost invisible on the platform entirely. Now think about what that means in practice. Recruiters at international companies are searching a database of 1.3 billion people. Caribbean professionals are 0.5% of that pool, concentrated into a handful of countries, competing against users in markets that have been building their LinkedIn presence for 15 years. The gap isn't just a disadvantage, it's a structural invisibility problem. And the only way to fight invisibility is to make sure that when a recruiter does find you, your profile gives them absolutely no reason to keep scrolling. To understand why this invisibility is so acute, we have to look at where we actually spend our time in the Caribbean. In markets like Trinidad and Tobago, Facebook remains the dominant force with a penetration rate of nearly 90% of the entire population as of March 2026. That is over 1.2 million users in TNT alone who are actively on Facebook, compared to just about 656,000 on LinkedIn. Across the wider region, the story is similar. Jamaica sees about 74% of Facebook penetration among internet users, while LinkedIn sits at a distant 18%. Then there's the engagement gap. As of 2025, TikTok has become the fastest growing platform in our region, with younger Caribbean users spending an average of 68 minutes a day on the app. That is significantly higher than the time they spend on Instagram at around 42 minutes or Facebook at around 35 minutes. Globally, TikTok's engagement rate has climbed to 3.7%, while LinkedIn's average engagement remains much more specialized and focused on professional utility rather than passive scrolling. The irony is that we are hyper-visible on the platforms that don't hire us. We are masters of Instagram Reels and the TikTok trends, yet we leave our professional corporate Facebook profiles, LinkedIn, to gather dust. In Puerto Rico, for instance, there are 2.6 million people on Facebook, but only 1.2 million on LinkedIn. We are essentially hanging out in the world's biggest backyard while the world's biggest office is next door, and we haven't even bothered to knock. Now, I want to step back from the individual tactics for a moment because there's a larger structural picture here that we don't talk about enough on this show, and it's important. Everything I've described so far, the skills first pivot, the ATS optimization, the search strategy, the LinkedIn presence, these are all things individuals can act on, and they should. But framing the Caribbean remote work gap as purely an individual behavior problem would be missing something real and significant. The Caribbean faces structural barriers to remote work participation that are distinct from what a professional in, say, Colombia or Poland faces. Let me be specific about what I mean. Internet infrastructure. Reliable, high-speed broadband is the basic infrastructure of remote work. It is not uniformly available across the Caribbean. Several islands still struggle with consistent connectivity, and international bandwidth costs remain high relative to income levels. Honestly, sometimes my own internet, when the weather is bad, oh my God, it is the worst. And for developer managing a production environment or a video producer on a deadline, intermittent connectivity isn't an inconvenience. It's a disqualifier. Payment infrastructure. This one doesn't get nearly enough attention. Many Caribbean banking systems impose strict caps on international transactions. Professionals trying to receive payments in foreign currency or freelancers billing international clients often run into institutional walls that simply don't exist in other markets. Trinidad and Tobago, for example, has periodically imposed hard caps on US dollar credit card spending that effectively make sustained global commercial participation almost impossible for individual entrepreneurs and freelancers. Regulatory frameworks. Now, remote work sits in a legal gray area in much of the Caribbean. Employment law hasn't caught up to the reality of someone in the region being employed by a company in, let's say, Germany. Tax treatment of foreign source income in a lot of cases is unclear. This ambiguity creates friction for workers, for employers, and for local financial institutions uncertain about how to handle foreign currency income. And I must say, Jamaica has definitely done a really good job of, navigating this gray area. It was an episode that I did with Colette Guthrie, so please check that out, where she talked about how to file your taxes as a remote worker living in Jamaica. Now compare this to what has been happening in Latin America. Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador have all introduced formal remote work legislation. Costa Rica passed its digital nomad law in 2022, offering specific visas, tax exemptions for qualifying remote workers, and legal clarity for internationally employed professionals. Within 2 years, the program generated over US $100 million in local economic activity and built co-working and professional support infrastructure around it. The key wasn't just the visa, it was the ecosystem built to support it. The Caribbean has been moving in a similar direction, but largely in the other direction, attracting incoming digital nomads rather than enabling local talent to participate in global remote work. Barbados, Antigua, Dominica, and several other islands have digital nomad visa programs. These programs are valuable, but they're designed to bring other people's remote workers to the Caribbean, not to help Caribbean workers become remote professionals for the world. That asymmetry is worth naming. Now let me bring in the Latin American context more fully here, because there are genuinely instructive lessons in what's happening across the region. Latin America has emerged as one of the most significant talent pools for international remote hiring. Research from multiple global staffing firms show that U.S. companies increased remote hiring in Latin America by over 150% between 2022 and 2024. Time zone alignment with North America, English proficiency in key markets, strong technical education, and significant cost differences relative to U.S. domestic salaries have all made the region attractive. But the LATAM story also has shadows worth understanding. The surge in demand from U.S. companies has created a bidding war for the best talent in countries like Colombia and Argentina. U.S. dollar salaries are pulling professionals away from local companies and public institutions. Healthcare systems, schools, and government agencies are struggling to compete. The brain drain dynamic that has long plagued the Caribbean is now beginning to appear in forms that it hasn't historically taken in larger LATAM economies. For the Caribbean, this is a preview and a warning. The goal shouldn't simply be to become a cheaper talent pool for North American companies. It should be to build a remote work ecosystem that strengthens rather than depletes the local professional community. That means a few things. Local companies adopting hybrid and remote models so that professionals don't have to choose between a global career and staying home. Educational institutions updating curricula to develop the specific competencies that global remote hiring actually rewards, not just degrees, but portfolios, practical skills, and digital fluency. And government investment in the infrastructure, broadband, banking frameworks, legal clarity that makes remote work participation viable. I want to close with something that I think is important to say clearly. A lot of the conversation around Caribbean professionals and remote work ends up in one of two places. Either it's pure hustle content, optimize your LinkedIn, tailor your resume, grind harder, or it's structural defeatism. The system is stacked against us. The infrastructure isn't there. The banks won't cooperate. Both of these framings miss the actual picture. The opportunity is real. The global remote work market isn't going away. Remote and hybrid options are now structurally embedded in how modern companies hire. The total volume of internationally accessible remote roles has never been larger. And Caribbean professionals have genuine advantages. English is the first language of many of the islands. Our cultural fluency with North American and European markets is deep, and our educational institutions produce graduates who are capable of competing on the global stage. But competing on the global stage requires knowing how this stage actually works. It requires understanding that a qualification is the minimum entry requirement, not a differentiator. That resume formatting is a technical problem, not an aesthetic one. That job searching globally is a discipline. Daily alerts, tailored applications, professional follow-through, sustained effort. And that your online professional presence isn't a formality. It's your searchable identity in a market where most hiring now begins with a recruiter query, not a human introduction. A recent piece by Caribbean digital strategist Karen Rose, published in the Jamaica Observer, cataloged many of these same patterns from conversations with hundreds of professionals across the region, PhD holders, experienced managers, skill developers, whose applications were going unanswered. His diagnosis aligns closely with what the data shows. The gap isn't primarily one of talent, it's one of strategy. The structural issues, infrastructure, bank, regulation, are real, and they require political and institutional action, but they are not a reason to sit still. They are a reason to push harder on the individual levers you can control while advocating loudly for the systemic changes that would unlock the full potential of Caribbean talent in the global market. We have the people, we have the capability. What we need is the strategy, the infrastructure, and the policy environment to turn that into outcomes. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Remote Islander. If this resonated with you, share it with someone in your network who's been grinding at applications without results, or someone who has the power to change the structural picture. If you're considering remote work, remember that it's never too late to take control of your career and pursue your dreams. Happy remote working. Bye, guys.